Two items of business before we get to our witnesses, colleagues. Subcommittee report was distributed to you yesterday. Can I have someone move it? Mr. May, any discussion? Seeing none, committee report passed. We also need a short study report or budget for this meeting, which may or may not go over to a second meeting. Can I have someone move that study budget? Mr. May, you're very cooperative today. Any discussion? Thank you very much. With that, we deal with items of business. At the end of the second hour, I want to just bring you up to date with where we're at on a variety of small issues. So I may call the meeting about 5 minutes early. With that, we have witnesses that have become quite familiar to this committee, which we're very thankful for, and we appreciate all of you making yourselves available to the committee. Kerry Buck, Senior Fellow at the Canadian Forces College and University of Ottawa Graduate School of International Affairs. Yeah, it's only 8:30 in the morning. And former Ambassador to NATO. And from the Ukrainian Congress, Ihor Mikolashin and Orest Zakidalski, Senior Policy Advisor. All of you are familiar with this committee, so I don't need to give you any instructions. We'll start with Ms. Bach. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before this committee in person, which is a novelty for me now. I'm appearing as an individual, and I'll speak to you entirely from a personal perspective, providing personal analysis based on my 30 years of experience in international security. I'll focus on two aspects of the war. First, how the war has evolved over the past year, where I think we are now, and second, what the challenges or risks are in the months ahead for Ukraine, NATO, and for NATO allies like Canada. The past 14 months of the war have been a surprise in many ways. Many commentators, myself included, were surprised that President Putin would choose to launch a full-scale war against Ukraine. I could not understand why it was in Russia's self-interest to do so. But I do think that one of the reasons Putin launched the war was because he thought NATO was weakened and that the West would have neither a strong nor a unified response. And Putin was surprised. The reaction of NATO has been more robust, more coherent, and more supportive of Ukraine than Putin expected and than I could have hoped for. But the war on Ukraine, as wars go, is still relatively young. So let me walk through how I see the evolution of the war since it first began in February 22. It's been through a few phases. Initial phase, as we know, where Putin and many Western commentators thought Russia would do well militarily, do it rapidly, and even be able to replace President Zelensky's government very quickly. That phase was short-lived. Another welcome surprise. I'm glad. The next phase was marked by a period of Ukrainian successes and rapid gains made possible by the resolve of Ukrainian troops, by inspirational Ukrainian leadership, and the mobilization of Ukrainian citizens. And without taking anything away from Ukraine's extraordinary effort, Western support was also a crucial part of the successful outcome. In particular, the training effort post-2014 by Canada, the UK, and others was key, as was the early policy shift to provide lethal weaponry. Now, the third phase of the war started around 10 months ago, and we're still in it. Russia started to concentrate its troops and artillery to the south and east of the country, focusing on consolidating and expanding its control of the Donbass and creating a buffer around Crimea. At the time, NATO Sec Gen Jens Stoltenberg said he expected the war to last a very long time, and I'm afraid he was right. So here we are today, 14 months after a brutal Russian attempt to invade all of Ukraine, millions of Ukrainians displaced, tens of thousands of casualties, and umpteen thousands of civilians murdered. Ukrainian critical infrastructure and cultural heritage have been destroyed, countless war crimes have been committed, and Russia is under heavy sanctions, in a way some of the heaviest ones imposed on any country since World War II. The fighting continues, and a new counteroffensive is being launched in what promises to be a grinding ground war, I think, along a 600-mile front. It looks like this conflict will last a long time. Where do I think the international community, NATO, and allies, such as Canada, need to focus in the months ahead? A few areas. First, maintenance of international support for Ukraine will be crucial, both in terms of political support as well as logistics. From my perspective, President Putin has more people to throw at the war in Ukraine and less to lose. He's shown a disregard for the fate of Russian soldiers and a propensity to use them as cannon fodder. A long, grinding war of attrition is in Russia's interests, and in fact, maybe their strategy, they've said as much publicly, hoping to see support from the West start to crumble. So, what do NATO and NATO allies need to do? NATO needs to put in place a longer-term strategic plan to provide weaponry and other support to Ukraine. For the past year, the support to Ukraine, the rhythm of support to Ukraine has been marked by President Zelensky asking for something specific, and then allies moving, sometimes quickly, sometimes more slowly, to find what is needed, provide the training, and get it into theater. But this is different from a strategic plan that ensures a steady flow of predictable support. Second, to achieve this, Allied defense production and procurement needs to be stepped up. Ukraine's burning through ammunition and weaponry faster than the West can provide it. Most crucial is Ukraine military meeting NATO standards, provides significant deterrent to Russia going forward. So during the war and after the war, we need to work to wean Ukraine away from Soviet-era equipment and toward full NATO interoperability. In terms of political support for Ukraine, I'll just say that this will take a lot of continuing diplomacy. We're already starting to see some NATO allies put positions on the table that are different, Hungary and Turkey. But it's not just about NATO, it's creating broader, worldwide, cross-regional support to not only isolate Russia, but to put pressure on Russia. And so that will involve talking to some countries that perhaps we may find their positioning less palatable, but they will be useful interlocutors with Russia. Finally, another question I expect high on the agenda, the Vilnius NATO summit, is Ukraine's future relationship with NATO. There, what I expect is a very vigorous debate, but no final conclusions. Will Ukraine be offered formal security guarantees? Will there be a clear path to NATO membership with concrete steps? Or will it be something interim until allies see where the war ends up? I'll leave it at that point, and in the question and answer period, we can look at some other areas in security and defense that Canada could help. Thank you.
Thank you. Ukrainian Congress, Mr. Mikolajin? Okay.
Thank you. I'll split my time with my colleague, but I'll begin. So again, thank you for the invitation to invite us here before this committee. As you know, the UCC is the voice of Canada's Ukrainian community. When we talk about the war, I think it's, as you know, important to understand that the war and the invasion started in 2014, and we are, in many ways, just talking about the escalation and the full-scale invasion, which started just more than a year ago. We do want to point out, as you know, the tremendous generosity and kindness of Canadians in supporting the Ukrainian refugees who fled, who have come to Canada, and that support for those who've ended up in Europe as refugees. We're here to talk about the latest human rights violations, which are, we feel, coming out as the next step in the evolution of this full-scale invasion. So as you've seen, no doubt, in the media, Russian human rights organizations have been posting video testimony from mercenaries from the Wagner Group, which is fighting in eastern Ukraine. The videos are very disturbing. I have the quotes from them in the transcript, but I don't really want to read them to you, but you know that they involve the murder of children, the murder of civilians, testimony that these people have gone in and murdered everybody in households, apartments, etc. There's also been very gruesome video posted of beheadings, of other acts of violence on Ukrainian prisoners of war. And the Office of the General Prosecutor of Ukraine says they have over 80,000 examples of war crimes and crimes against humanity being committed by the invading Russian army. So mass rape, torture, murder, forced deportation, mass abduction of children are some of the litany of crimes that Russia has committed and is committing every day in its war against Ukraine. Our point is to say that these are not rogue actions of rogue soldiers. They are not random. They are deliberate, systemic, and planned. We believe Russia is a criminal state which should be isolated further from the international community. in keeping with the direction of the Parliament on unanimous action on Russia's acts in Ukraine as an act of genocide and listing the Wagner Group as a terrorist entity, we will continue to argue, and we urge for your support to argue that Russia must be designated as a state sponsor of terrorism and that Russian diplomats must be expelled from Canada.
Thank you, Ihor. I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that Canada and allies should and can be providing to Ukraine to help Ukraine win this war. The aid provided to Ukraine by Canada and allies has indeed been impressive, and coupled with the Ukrainian people's incredible courage and fierce resistance to Russia's genocidal war, the aid has allowed the Ukrainian armed forces first to stop the Russian advances and then reverse many of the early Russian gains and liberate hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens. However, as Ukraine plans a spring and summer counteroffensive, it's crucial that both the military and economic support being delivered to Ukraine be increased substantially. First, Ukraine needs more heavy weapons than we and our allies are providing right now. So tanks, armored personnel carriers, air defense systems, longer-range missile systems, naval defense systems, artillery, and the ammunition for these systems. Next, Ukraine needs fighter jets to protect its skies and continue to deny Russia air superiority. Several of our allies, for example, Poland and Slovakia, are delivering MiGs to Ukraine. Canada can play a key role in assisting with training Ukrainian pilots on NATO jets and in convincing allies of the need to supply Ukraine with more fighter jets. Finally, the security of both Canada, our European allies, and Ukraine require a sustained commitment to increasing production and procurement of weapons and ammunition. We need to make multi-year investments to make sure we have the stocks to deal with the current and future Russian aggression. Once Ukraine defeats Russia in this war, Russia will still remain an enemy of Ukraine, an adversary to NATO, and a threat to peace in Europe. So we need to be prepared. Finally, I want to stress the urgency of what we believe Canada needs to do. The longer we and our allies wait to deliver to Ukraine the tools the Ukrainians need for victory, the more Ukrainian soldiers and civilians are killed, wounded, or injured, and the larger the price the Ukrainians must pay. The Ukraine Defense Contact Group, the defense ministers of some 50 countries supporting Ukraine, are meeting at Ramstein Air Base in Germany today to discuss the next steps in supporting Ukraine's defense of freedom, and it is our fervent hope that Ukraine's allies, and Canada key among them, will deliver to Ukraine the tools that are needed to win. And I will stop there, and we're pleased to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Brizan, 6 minutes, please.
Good morning, and welcome all our witnesses. Great to see all of you again. Just wanted to dig in a little bit more because both of you have touched on the procurement side of this. There was an announcement this morning of 40 sniper rifles being purchased to be supplied to Ukraine, coming out of Winnipeg from PGW. I can tell you that sniper rifle procurement was asked for last year by the Ukrainian government. The procurement was completed by the company, completely built and purpose ready by the end of last summer. And here we are almost a year later before it was finally announced and the rifles are going to be moving. So when we look at procurement in general, when you talk about, and Ambassador Buck touched on the need for more ammunition, and we know that when you look at other facilities and capabilities here in Canada, that we do have JDLS, actually it's JD, General Dynamics Ordnance and Tactical Systems, just outside of Montreal, that can build purpose-ready ammunition, including the M155 rounds to go in our 777 howitzers that Ukraine has 4 of them, as well as 777s from other allies. Do you think that we need to actually start moving a little quicker on getting this procurement fixed? And what's the big holdup from the standpoint of both, former NATO ambassadors as well as the community with UCC as to what some of the impediments are to actually getting ammunition, sniper rifles, and other military material procured for Ukraine.
Mr. Michalation? Sure.
Absolutely, and I know that Jens Stoltenberg and other NATO allies have recognized, coming out of NATO meetings, that production needs to be ramped up and it needs to be sped up. Absolutely. The challenge is, as I said, that Ukraine has been, for very, very good reasons, burning through ammunition and weaponry faster than it can be supplied. And what's happening now is that gaps in defense production sector have been identified. Procurement, I can't, again, I'm speaking to this personally from outside. I've seen procurement work, and I've seen procurement work very, very badly. In my personal wish list, I would love to see a review of procurement processes, a full-on review, a bipartisan review, so that we don't have reversals of decisions, which I've seen personally over the last couple of decades. Thanks.
Thank you.
Just quickly, agreed that the current system isn't good enough. We've heard that industry is looking for multi-year commitments, so that's something to look at. Having been in Kyiv in May and June, the Ukrainian defense minister was pleading with us to go and speak with you as parliamentarians and the Canadian government. Kyiv is littered with Russian burnt-out tanks. You can see the scale of the equipment that is being destroyed every day by the Ukrainians and by the Russians, and it's well beyond anything that we could imagine. So I think we just have to. Again, I don't know the solution to procurement, but the current system is not fast enough, and it cannot be acceptable that it takes a year to get these kind of things to Ukraine when soldiers are dying every day.
So question back to UCC. We know that in the federal budget that there was very little in this budget in 2023 for Ukraine, and there's $200 million from a defense standpoint. There's $200 million that was announced to go to the Canadian Armed Forces, supposedly to help replace the Leopard tanks that were donated. So was UCC and the rest of the Ukrainian community disappointed in this last budget as much as I was?
Thank you. So we were concerned and surprised about the amount that was in the budget for defense in Ukraine, which was, as you said, $200 million for the Leopard tanks that had been previously announced. We had submitted and we're happy to share with the committee our pre-budget submission, which, as Mr. Zakadaisky outlined, was the significant need for systems, and large numbers of systems to Ukraine. We are hopeful that our commentary post-budget and the defense review process will illuminate the point further, and we are hearing that there is the possibility of more being announced, as was last year, beyond the budget. But we are concerned that the budget didn't send the signal of strong support for Ukraine in the year ahead.
So when we look at this letter that came out from a number of leading Canadians, both former cabinet ministers, retired military leaders, academics, they talked about how bad defense spending has gotten in Canada, how we aren't able to step up and do the task at hand. And then you combine that with the leaked Pentagon documents on the Discord app. And we know that the back channel discussions that have been taking place, especially at the NATO level among diplomats. And so the question to Ambassador Buck is, would you say that based upon your time in Brussels, and you look at the discussions that are taking place today and with a lot of your former colleagues, was the comments made in the Pentagon documents reflective of what you're hearing in diplomatic circles here in Ottawa today?
Yeah, the challenge is I haven't seen those documents, but what I understand is in them. I agree with some of the criticism, and I really disagree with some of the other criticism. First main message is that Canada really is a strong NATO ally, and we've got enormous respect there. We've contributed in one way or the other to every NATO operation, and I believe in that. Second thing is, over decades of underinvestment through successive governments, we aren't keeping up our end of the NATO defense spending bargain. We're getting close to the bottom of the barrel, and we need to do more. I signed that letter too. Thank you.
Madame Lambropoulos, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to begin by thanking our witnesses for taking the time to be with us today. My questions are going to go primarily to Ms. Buck. You've recently written that as the war drags on, Western unity and resolve may falter along the way and as we go forward. And I'm wondering, what are some of the fault lines that you've noticed are emerging in the Western Alliance, and what role can Canada play in helping maintain the unity?
Thank you for the question. I actually think that NATO unity has been rock solid from the beginning, but there are some fault lines showing, as you mentioned. Some allies like Turkey and Hungary are starting to take positions that could harm NATO unity and could harm NATO unity on Ukraine. And I think that quiet, constant pressure inside NATO is needed to stay the course. Sometimes that will break out into public pressure. I think it would be very important to see when Turkey reverses its position and allows Sweden into the alliance. I'm convinced that will happen, but it hasn't happened soon enough to my liking. So it's a question of quiet diplomacy, honestly, and we've been successful at that at NATO over the years. But there's some more diplomacy that is needed. As I said, international political support for Ukraine is about cross-regional global support. And I really have to applaud the work by Ambassador Ray, our diplomatic missions around the world. They've been doing to convince states from all regions of the world to vote at the UN General Assembly, for instance, to isolate Russia, and a smaller number has agreed to put sanctions, maintain sanctions on Russia, but this is going to need constant care and feeding. So whenever I call for more defense spending, I also call for more spending and more investment in our international diplomatic and civilian security tools as well, because that's part of the bookend to maintain support.
Okay, thank you very much. And I guess you, in a way, answered it, but just in case there's anything else that you see, are there weaknesses in the alliance's ability to address the conflict going forward? You've mentioned that it's going to be it could potentially be a very long war, and that it will continue for a long time. So what are some of the weaknesses that you see going forward on the alliance's side?
Well, I think that the primary weakness is a practical, logistical one right now around provision of weaponry and support to Ukraine. I'm less worried about maintaining political support. I'm more worried about keeping a steady flow of the right weaponry into Ukraine. And so I would hope that the Vilnius summit would come out with a strategic plan that has a longer-term approach to providing a predictable supply of weaponry rather than that kind of stop and start we've seen over the last year. But I think that's going to happen at the summit. At least there's some indications from public pronouncements from the SecGen.
Okay, thank you very much. For the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, I appreciate your interventions today. I understand that the community here is most likely living a very difficult moment and has been for the last year and a half or so. And you've mentioned a few of the things you would like Canada to do more, and that's including training Ukrainians on Canadian jets, on NATO jets. Can you maybe be a little bit more specific on what role you think Canada, or what role you would like Canada to play in this war going forward?
Well, as we said, I mean, I think that there are sort of two areas. One is the increased supply of weapons, and the other is increased training. I mean, as Ambassador Buck mentioned, Ukraine is moving to a NATO standard army, and Canada is very well suited to train Ukrainians. Has been since 2015. Over 30,000 Ukrainian troops have been trained, and frankly, that has made an enormous difference for Ukraine's army. So anything we can do to increase that will be helpful. But right now, like in the next weeks and months, the supply of weapons is crucial. And we stress the urgency of that. There are millions of Ukrainian citizens suffering under Russian occupation who need to be liberated. And the Ukrainians can do it, but they need the weapons from us.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chair, how much time do I have left?
45 seconds.
How many?
45.
45.
Now down to 35. Yeah.
Thank you. So I guess my next question is, you've both spoken a lot about the new offensive that's going to be taking place in the spring and summer. And I'm sure that Ukraine feels strong going into this and has been feeling a momentum going forward. Do you think that it will be a successful offensive? Do you think that they're going to gain some of what they've lost back? And what can you say about what you believe may happen in the next coming months?
Again, an important question, but Ms. Lambropoulos has run through her time. I'm sure that question will weave itself through the balance of the after morning here. Madame Michaud, bienvenue au comité.
Welcome to the committee. You have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. It's really much appreciated to have you here. I noticed this week that the NATO Secretary General, Mr. Stoltenberg, was in Kyiv, and more so we're hearing potential Ukraine potentially joining NATO, potentially in the case of a victory, so perhaps not in the short term. What does this mean to Ukrainians, and what does it mean for the current NATO members? I realize it may mean some security issues, some concerns for some allies. I'd like to hear what your perspective is on this, Madam Buck, and then the other gentleman from the Congress. If you could start telling us what it means for Ukraine and what it means for the allies. In 2008, at the Bucharest summit, the allies agreed on an important sentence in the summit declaration, and I can't remember what it was in French.
Ukraine will become members of NATO. But since then, there have been no concrete technical steps along the path to membership. And that became more complicated in 2014 when Russia took part of Ukraine, illegally annexed Crimea, because the argument from some inside NATO is that that creates an immediate Article 5 situation. So what do I mean about that? Article 5 is what I call the Three Musketeers Clause of NATO, all for one for all. And if a NATO ally is attacked, then other allies are meant to come to that nation's defense. So it complicated it politically, and yet that language stayed about Ukraine will become a member of NATO. But the thing that NATO allies have done consistently since 2008 and even more post-2014 is a very significant program of support to Ukraine, Ukrainian military security, and then also outside of NATO, a lot of support on the civilian front. So what will happen in Vilnius, as I said, I don't expect an answer to that question about Ukrainian membership, but I do find it really significant that Jens Stoltenberg said yesterday that Ukraine's rightful place is in the Euro-Atlantic, place is in NATO over time. So that debate at the Vilnius summit will be crucial. I don't expect answers at that time unless something miraculous happens with the course of the war between now and Vilnius.
Merci.
Thank you, gentlemen.
There's a great meme going around that says that nobody's done more to support increase support in Ukraine for NATO membership than Vladimir Putin, and I think it's very clear that Ukraine has decided its future is going to be in the European Union, in the Euro-Atlantic Alliance in some form, immediately and long term. And I think with the ascension of Finland and the potential of other countries to join NATO, Ukraine sees a path for itself as part of the alliance, and as we know, has close working relationships with Canada and others bilaterally, and then international groups on the training front. So I think that it remains an open question, as Ambassador said, but we see that public support in Ukraine is moving in that direction very strongly.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Earlier, you were referring to, you were telling us about what was expected from Canada in terms of assistance in the future. You were certainly talking about training weaponry. We know Canada is in Latvia. Is that enough at this point? Is that presence enough? We know there are shortages in terms of staffing within the Canadian Armed Forces. From going from a battalion to a brigade, is that something that can happen despite these issues? And should we focus actually on that training, whether it's in Latvia, whether there may be needs elsewhere, if we should do more in terms of training? What do you have to say?
I think our capacity to increase training is the same issue as our capacity to increase the production of weapons. It's a matter of the government making it a priority and investing the funds necessary in it. In terms of what is available like right now to augment these missions, I mean, I think we do have some capacity to increase training missions for Ukraine now, but certainly it is a long-term commitment and a long-term issue, and I think we need to be making those investments in our defense now.
Excuse me, at the last NATO summit, there was agreement by all allies that the size of the battle groups, the existing battle groups that were created in 2017 would be increased, and that new battle groups were being put in place. So that commitment is there across all allies, and Canada has to meet that commitment. I can't speak to the stage of preparedness now, but I'll go back to the letter I signed and others signed about the need to invest more. And one of the main gaps in the CAF right now is people, and so they're working as hard as they can to increase recruitment and retention. It's something that needs a lot of care and feeding. But the government's committed to increase its size and presence in Latvia, and that's vitally important to NATO deterrence. And I know that was the rationale. I was there when we took the decision to take on that battle group, and I know that the Canadian policy has been that deterrence has to be sufficiently robust.
Merci, Madame Michaud. Madame Matheson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, and thanks to all the witnesses today for appearing. One of the things, so London has provided the LAVs, the LAVs out of GDLS. When I was speaking to the Ukrainian ambassador to Canada, there was a lot of frustration in terms of the delay on that. Could you give us an update in terms of what you've heard, if anything, on the delivery of those LAVs and the use of those LAVs?
I mean,
Sure,
or the delay of those LAVs.
I understand that I don't have the details. I know that they were focusing on the ones that were nearly built or being built, very close to the time of the announcement, as opposed to sort of starting from scratch. It's been a matter of media speculation, and I think for operational reasons, they're not, the Ukrainians and the Canadians are not revealing exactly where they're at, but in the scope of the procurement issues that have been described before, I do understand that they're not in place where they as soon as they were supposed to be.
So So you don't have any on the ground updates?
I don't.
No. Okay. In terms of, again, I want to talk about London all the time. In my writing, there's an international test pilot school. They're world-renowned, and they've trained allied fighter pilots, like I said, from around the world. They learn to train with those jets, and they use flight simulators. There have been numerous conversations about ensuring that Ukrainian pilots come to test at this facility, and as I think it was I think it was Orst, I can't say your last name, I'm so sorry, had said there's this transition to NATO equipment and NATO weaponry. And so that kind of training from NATO allies is key. There has been a lot, unfortunately, of buffers or barriers that have come before both sides. So I'd really love for you to talk again about that specific training, increasing the training. I know that Op Unifier has been an incredible resource for troops in Ukraine, but in all the different ways that Canada can train troops for Ukraine.
I mean, one of the most important things to remember about training is that our army is also learning from the Ukrainians, and so it is, to the extent we can enlarge any of these missions, move towards training fighter pilots. I mean, we're going to do it eventually anyway, so we might as well do it now. In these missions, there is always a large benefit to our military as well, and I think we need to look at it from that. No, we're not just helping the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians are helping us as well.
If I can just chime in, on the support programs, I was at the Invictus event last night with some of the members here, and it's beyond just the training of test pilots. I think there's a real scope. Ukraine is a country of veterans and families of survivors and both those injured and killed. And so I think there is a whole of society need in Ukraine for broad mental health support, for supports for veterans, for entrepreneurship now and post-war. And so I think we have certainly had a flood of people come to our office with proposals of every kind on each of those spheres of what Canada can do as Canadian business, as Canadian government, as a nonprofit sector, as community. So I don't think there's any lack of ideas or support. Sometimes it's a matter of funding and finding the right partner. And I think at this point, Ukraine is eager to take on partnerships with any kind of partner that will help it in this victory in the nearest time. But we also need to be thinking about those men and women that are serving and their families, in the midst of this.
Ms. Buck, you had talked about Canada's increasing in many different types of spending, but I wanted you to expand potentially on what you were talking about in terms of that diplomatic spending, what Canada's not doing and where we need to go on that diplomatic side.
It's about presence, it's about skills, and it's about diplomatic initiative. So it's not always about investing more money in our foreign ministries to get the product, but it is about investing some more money. I won't go through kind of the world and where I think we shouldn't have shut down missions, where I think we should establish missions. It's probably beyond the scope of this committee and beyond the scope of my notes, which I have to do myself now that I've retired, and it's a real challenge. But it's, I find a real diminution of our capacity internationally and of our knowledge base internationally, our skill set internationally on some issues, and we do need to rebuild it. And so when we're faced with a conflict like Ukraine, you need a whole of Canada effort to work and build support with our key allies, our like-minded partners, to maintain support for Ukraine. So as I said, I really give some kudos to Ambassador Ray and his team, our missions around the world, but that's going to take constant care and feeding. But then the other thing, we have to talk to some of the countries that have leverage that have leverage with Russia, and that is going to be key to bringing about some kind of peace settlement at some point when President Zelensky calls the time for a peace settlement. So we need China experts. We need people who are close to India who can help apply some pressure to Russia, and other places where you need a full court press to convince President Putin that it's time to either down arms and come to a table, or I can't even start to guess where this war will go next steps. So it's diplomacy, capacity, and expertise and links to talk to the bad guys and to talk to the good guys to build up that support.
We're going to have to leave it there.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, we're on to the next round, colleagues. I'm going to let it go as a full round because our next panel is one witness, and we may be able to make up some time there. So, Ms. Gallant, 5 minutes, please.
Chairman, so to our former NATO ambassador, the NATO Secretary General has indicated the 2% of GDP aspirational goal for defense spending will become the minimum expenditure. What are the most immediate and effective measures Canada can take to both bolster Ukraine and their defense forces while shedding our reputation in NATO as a freeloader?
Well, I'll go back. I actually think that our reputation in NATO is pretty good. But the 2% goal, and it is a goal, and Canada's been clear that it's a goal and non-binding through two governments now. It's a very important political standard, and it's a very important political measure that is becoming more important. And it's becoming more important because of the war, but for us also because all of our allies are climbing higher and higher, and we're not. Part of it is because our GDP is doing a bit better than some of our allies, so that's something it's good news, but the percentage is dropping. But part of it is because of underinvestment over successive governments that's coming to roost now. What happened in 2017 with Strong, Secure, and Engaged is that they actually have a plan for a 73% hike in spending, which is impressive. But that 73% hike in spending, which is the most significant hike in defense spending that we've seen in decades, hasn't quite come to fruition. Not enough people, procurement processes are too slow, etc. So we have a lot to do, and our stats at NATO are bad. Right now, in 2022, we were 25th among the allies in terms of percentage of GDP spent on defense, and in terms of percentage of defense, share of defense spending spent on equipment, we were second to last. And that's not great. So we need to do more, thus the letter, as I said, that I signed, where so in terms of support for Ukraine, weapons, training, and when the war does come to an end, I think that we could have a really useful role to help the Ukrainian military transition to a peacetime footing, and we'll learn a lot from them too, from their war experience, and help them move up to that NATO interoperable standard and maintain it.
It sounds like we're just still aspiring to the 2% rather than recognizing it will become the floor, and they need to move forward on it becoming the floor because nobody's really ever getting to that 2%. They just get closer to it. It's like a law of diminishing returns. So with respect to that, how would you say that we could strategize? What should be the strategy to move forward and actually win this war in Ukraine, for Ukraine, in our role as support?
Well, to win the war, I'll go back to weapons, ammunition, bandage. Like, we're at a really critical point right now, and I think that NATO has done admirably in supplying Ukraine, and they need to do more faster. Absolutely.
Ihor, now we know there are charges that can be raised for war crimes. What about the people who influence and encourage the genocide in Ukraine? Are there any international laws that could hold the people who are doing this to account?
So there are several processes going on led by Ukraine that Canada has been supporting. First is the war crimes and genocide prosecution through the International Criminal Court. And the second that Ukraine is pursuing, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, is the war of aggression prosecution. And that's where there is still ongoing discussion on how Ukraine can lead that process, but with an international criminal prosecution process. It's part of the investigations that are happening. We know that many countries have sent investigators.
Will the influencers be charged as well as the people actually committing the crimes?
I hope so. I mean, I think that the evidence is there from a speeches and media perspective in terms of who was encouraging and supporting and boosting the committing of these crimes and how they're being portrayed as great Russian victories.
Mr. May, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here and sharing your time with us this morning. Madam Buck, during your intervention, I was reflecting on how we've come to where we are, and the early days of before the war even started. All the speculation as to what was going to happen, and there were three theories that were quite prevalent that were shared with us, but also throughout the media. One was nothing was going to happen, and a lot of that was actually coming from within Ukraine, that this was just saber rattling. Two, that it was going to be similar to Crimea in that they would, blitz in and redraw the border around the two Donbass provinces. And call it a day, or three, it would be over in a week, and they'd drive right through Ukraine as liberators, and it would be over within a matter of days. Obviously, none of that happened. Nobody was talking about a protracted war that I heard of. I guess my question to you and to the panel as a whole is, how has our thinking changed in terms of the intelligence gathering around Russia's capabilities and as importantly, Ukraine's capabilities now that it's being supported so heavily by NATO? Is there a different strategy on how we're actually thinking about this? Because I know it's been asked already about what's to come, and I know no one has a crystal ball, but over a year ago, everyone seemed to have a crystal ball and had very strong opinions as to what was going to happen. And I'm curious, everyone's being that we've talked to has been very quiet about speculating. I'm going to put you guys on the spot and say, how can we think moving forward, or how should we be thinking moving forward as to how this is going to resolve itself? Or is this going to continue for many years to come? We'll start with Madam Buck.
How's our thinking changed? So the kind of orthodoxy when I was at NATO was that Russia had invested significantly in revamping and modernizing its own military since 2008, and that they would be one of the more impressive fighting forces in the world. And we discovered that wasn't as true as we had thought, that they were substandard, that they were incapable of mounting that kind of complex and robust invasion of a country. And part of the reason I thought this didn't make any sense, because for Vladimir Putin to choose this, how is he going to hold Ukraine afterwards? I don't understand the calculus, unless I think it's only and all about him maintaining his power at home and him being afraid of a prosperous democracy that's improving economically right next door in Ukraine in a way that he hasn't been delivering to his own citizens and can't. Then it kind of makes sense, right? So how have we shifted in thinking about Russia's capabilities? The other thing that's happened is that he has started to he started some limited conscription that didn't go well politically for him. So now they've got a charm offensive and trying to have quotas out in regions outside Moscow to get more and more soldiers to throw at the problem, clearing out prisons. He doesn't care if his soldiers die. At some point politically that'll come home to roost for him, but it hasn't yet. So he can keep throwing literally Russian young men's bodies at this problem for quite a long time to come, which is too bad. It's too bad for the Russians. Where it will end, there are different scenarios. I don't see many scenarios where he is ousted from power. And whatever scenario it is, we'll have to collectively deal with Russia, right? Somehow, in a way that recognizes that they're right next door to Ukraine and will be forever, and that they're part of Europe. So at some point, peace talks will have to happen, but I firmly believe it has to be President Zelensky's call when the time is right, and it can only happen when Ukraine has had sufficient territorial gains that Putin is forced to the table.
Gentlemen, we've left you about 30 seconds or less, I
Sorry.
think. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I'll just say that the course of the war in a large measure depends on what we are capable of providing the Ukrainians.
Thank
If they run out of artillery, they can't fire artillery.
Thank you, Mr. May. Madame Michaud, 2.5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Much has been said about Ukraine and the assistance Canada can provide, considering the fact that Russia was not at all expecting such a strong resistance from Ukraine, and that it's been over 14 months now. In fact, you said it started in 2014, that this war started back then. How do you view the Russian troops? Are they getting tired? Are they having supply issues? I know that you mentioned that it will likely last a while, but I'm wondering what you think about the situation on the Russian side, based on your knowledge, Madam Buck.
We all saw the pictures of the Russian tanks and other vehicles mired in mud because they hadn't bothered to change the tires for the 2 years in storage before they deployed. And I think it's worse on the personnel front. And as I said, they're, with a combination of Wagner Group and others, they're really stretching their conscription efforts into places that aren't sustainable for them. So they're doing very, very badly. But they are a very large country with a lot of people, and they've got a lot of weapons in reserve. They're not good weapons. You know, they'll be running out of cruise missiles at some point, but they have enough stuff to keep grinding for a while in a grinding ground war of attrition in the south, and that will cause so much damage to Ukraine and a little less damage to Russia because of how Putin's a dictator. He doesn't bear the political costs of doing that as much as other leaders might.
Merci.
Thank you.
And ill-equipped as they are still a significant fighting force that we should not take lightly. And as I was reading you earlier, the brutality and the scale of the impact that the Russian forces, whether it's Wagner or the Russian army, have had in Ukraine should not be forgotten in the stories of their, technical incompetence. So it's the scale, it's the continued relentless dispatch of these people, of these soldiers, and as we said, the emptying of jails to create Russian brigades. These people are not professional soldiers. They are murdering Ukrainian civilians, and that is their instruction, and that is an explicit strategy by the Russian military.
Madame Michaud, 2.5 minutes. Ms. Madison.
I wanted to ask, throughout the war, Russia has used food as a destabilizing weapon. Can you talk about the impacts of that on the ground, that food stability and on the impact on Ukraine's food supply chains?
Sure, I can. As you know, there have been several attempts to have these grain deals brokered by the United Nations and others. Ukraine's role as a supplier of the global South, particularly the Middle East and African countries, for wheat, for sunflower oil, and other essential.
Appel au règlement, Monsieur le Président.
We've lost interpretation into French, Mr. Chair.
We lost interpretation. Well, the interpretation says it's okay. Okay. Back on.
So Ukraine's role as a supplier of agriculture, essential agriculture for the global South, I think has been illuminated by this latest invasion. I think what Canada can do to help there is Ukraine is trying to engage these allies in the global South, but that's a difficult task to do in the middle of fighting a war. And so I think, again, talking to countries that have been affected by the war, where food prices and shortages have come up. We need to make that non-linear argument and connect the dots for people that prices are going up because of this war.
So exactly as Ms. Buck was talking about, in terms of finding those maybe potentially difficult allies or tougher allies and convincing them of this overall would be a really good connect in that way, and using food stability would be a good way to connect.
Yeah, I think many people didn't realize how dependent they were on Ukrainian agriculture to ensure their stability and prosperity. And I think that rebuilding global security starts with supporting Ukrainian agriculture.
I think to maybe add to that, that was a lot of nods. So I'll give the rest of my time to you to add on to that.
Well, just in wild agreement. So if you think about if you think about food shortages and the impact on food prices around the world and on grain supply, so you don't think of it, but Rome, FAO. So our mission in Rome would have been actively lobbying at the FAO to talk about Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, to talk about how we stabilize food prices, how we help the poorest of the poor. We would have been doing that through a lot of our development assistance as well. So it's all arms of Canadian government international intervention, development assistance, diplomacy, that has to kick in to do that. And then we also have to be equipped to counter Russian disinformation, because as soon as that started, they were out there with disinformation saying, well, this is the result of X, Y, or Z, not the result of what we've done in Ukraine. And so our capacity to diplomatically and in Canada to rebut that disinformation, that propaganda, is really key.
Thank you, Ms. Masson. Ms. Masson and I were exposed to a very sophisticated response to misinformation and disinformation while we were in Taiwan, and I think we would both agree that there's a lot to be learned from how they deal with it. With that, Mr. Kelly, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Ms. Buck, just if I may take you back to some of the questions, the line of question that Mr. Bazan was getting to at the end of his, or as part of his opening round. The 2% goal, aspirational goal, was, if I understand, was set in 2014, about a 10-year, over a 10-year period to meet that aspirational goal. So it's, I'm not sure I could agree that successive governments over a long period of time have not dealt with what was really a specific goal set out in 2014. Now, we had a leak that alleges that our Prime Minister had explicitly, in contradiction of stated policy, said that Canada will not meet that goal. Are you concerned that statement undermines our commitment to NATO at a time when this war is explicitly testing the unity of this alliance?
Thank you for that. Just to be clear, my intervention was about underinvestment in defense by successive governments, and in a way it goes back to about the 70s, and it's coming to roost now. And to be fair, I mean, the last two governments, there's been more focus on defense. And as I said, strong, secure, and engaged, the defense policy was the most significant, planned increase in defense spending. Does this have a diplomatic impact on us, the fact that we're getting farther away from the 2% goal? Absolutely. Does it have a reputational impact? It absolutely has a reputational impact. And that can be filled with us doing more. I would, in my heart of hearts, I would like to see a path to 2%, or a path to 2%, if that's possible. And I would like to see specific investments in defense and security and diplomacy. I'd love to see an integrated policy. You can't do defense policy in a vacuum without our foreign policy priorities being set, fully integrated like the UK does. More investment on CAF people. More on North American defense, not just NORAD, air and land, submarines, cyber, people, and above all people, so we can step up and do more as it's needed. Because NATO has to do a lot more now with the war against Ukraine, and all allies need to step up.
Thank you. You also mentioned the announced spending in strong, secure, and engaged, and yet the announcements are not being fulfilled. We have, and you mentioned some of the reasons and some of the ways in which those goals are not being met through problems of procurement, problems with personnel. Can you expand on how, what needs to change in order to actually fulfill the commitments that were announced? It's easy to announce, but the follow through is what actually counts.
I'm sitting outside government now, so I don't know. I'm not really privy to the steps that are being taken and the hurdles inside, but from outside, I think part of it is a capacity issue. As I said, if you don't have the people, you can't stabilize the Canadian Armed Forces enough to have the procurement experts, etc. But so, I mean, on procurement, as I said, I'd love to see a review. Okay. We've been stumbling in a way on procurement for far too long.
We sure
and
have.
We don't get the stuff.
I've been given the signal. I got a minute left, I think. Okay. And there's one specific item. We actually was reviewing an order paper that was tabled actually by our colleague Mr. May last year, that last June, that said, for example, that there were 62 LAV-2 Coyotes that were in repairable condition, that were surplus and repairable. They would need, according to the statement they tabled, 220 days to repair to be able to ship. That was 305 days ago. This is the kind, we have no word or no announcement on whether these repairs are happening, whether these vehicles will be sent. Is this the type of disconnect between just announcing and actually following through and having the capacity to do what's announced?
Well, and there's some areas, like the Leopards, they were decisive in Afghanistan, but have we kept them up since Afghanistan? No. We cut air defense in 2012. There's all sorts of areas.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Final 5 minutes to Mr. Sousa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ambassador Kelly, you went through sort of the timelines over the last number of years to provide, Russia's justification for invading Crimea and now subsequently to all of Ukraine. And Mr. Yor, you reminded us that that's actually having an opposite effect. It's actually strengthened NATO's resolve, which is great. It's also created some geopolitical alliances, though, for Russia, economic alliances, and that's also worrisome. And what I'm curious about is the Russian people themselves. And Ambassador, you talked a little bit about that, and I'm wondering, the uprising doesn't seem to be occurring in Russia, right? That we need to see that in order to reaffirm that what Russia is doing is being the aggressor. Of course, they're not listening, they're not hearing that. Yet, many Russians are dying, as you pointed out, and much of Russia's resources are being utilized to support this war, which then gives me pause with regards to that economic alliances that they may be having elsewhere. And we've heard testimony before this committee in regards to Russia's disinformation campaign. And we've heard, and I quote, "The Kremlin's anti-Ukrainian narratives aim to erode public support for Ukraine and to intimidate and dehumanize Canadians of Ukrainian heritage." And that was Marcus Kolga back in February of 2023. So my question is, UCC specifically, what have you observed on this front with respect to Russia's disinformation campaign, and how have these efforts evolved over the course of the conflict?
Thank you. Well, I unfortunately, the statistics coming out of Russia are that 70% of the Russian population supports the war, and so despite all the reality of the numbers killed, we see that number doesn't go down, and as you mentioned. They have strong disinformation heralded by their ambassador to Canada. And so we don't understand why he is regularly, why he's here and regularly featured in Canadian media. And he's called us terrible names. He's called many of the people in this room terrible names. And he slurs our community on a daily basis, as he does with the Canadian government. So that is baffling to us. I think we need to remember that Russia is Canada's northern neighbor, whether we like it or not, and we need to take that very seriously. And up our game on what our expectations are of what's coming at us. I think that there was some naivete and some hope that perhaps, this could all be resolved in different ways, but we're seeing the reality of it now. So individual Canadians, individual Ukrainian Canadians are bearing the brunt of it in terms of the acts of hate and vandalism that are happening across Canada that we're documenting and hearing every day. I would love to share with you our social media feed in terms of the slurs coming at our community from Russian bots every day. So I think it is a serious issue that, we might have been a bit naive about as a society.
Ambassador, how do we combat that? Like, what do we do? I mean, it's one thing for us to now fight that disinformation within Canada, but what are we doing in terms of propaganda towards, not propaganda, what are we doing to inform Russian people as well?
First on propaganda, I think that requires a whole of society response. And as you said, Mr. Chair, we can learn a lot from countries like Estonia and Taiwan, who sit next to very powerful countries that engage very well in disinformation. They're better at it than we are. Part of it is they have whole society responses. So in Finland, for instance, they teach kids in school how to recognize disinformation, so they can weed out on social media what's false and what's true. And we need a better security culture, I think, at all levels, provincial, federal, even municipal sometimes, so that we can understand when we're being attacked by disinformation, when our citizens are. So that's civilian investment in cyber, but also in building some of the other I call them building blocks of democracy, like independent media, free media, electoral systems, etc. We're pretty good on that front, but still need to do more. On the Russian people, there are polls and then there are polls. It's a little dangerous in Russia to answer the wrong way. So I give them a grain of salt, but if you look at some of the more credible polling in Russia, it's showing the same numbers that he just said.
Really?
Yeah, but I mean, part of it is if you've been under that kind of czarist dictator's approach to governing, it takes an awful lot before there's an uprising. There have been uprisings in Russian history. I don't think Russia's anywhere near that. Russians are anywhere near that point of rising up. And the thing is that Vladimir Putin's got rid of any of his potential rivals through a series of defenestrations, suiciding people, and poisonings. So
Thank you,
I won't dare to predict what will happen there.
Thank you, Mr. Sousa. Unfortunately, that brings our time to an end, and I say unfortunate because all of you have been absolutely superb witnesses. You'll be interested to know that just prior to your witness, we adopted a study, an intention to study procurement, which, given the testimony that you've all come forward with, it will be, we may reach out to you again for your thoughts on it. It's very exasperating, this process, so we hope to bring some enlightenment. With that, I'm going to suspend and we'll re-empanel in as soon a time as we can. Again, on behalf of the committee members, thank you. Watling, Senior Research Fellow for Land Warfare, Royal United Services Institute. Dr. Watling, thank you for coming, and you're welcome to your first 5-minute intervention. We look forward to what you have to say for the next 5 minutes, and then we'll go to rounds of questions. So, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. My background in connection with this topic is that I have been working in Ukraine throughout the war, on the ground every other month, essentially, and largely working with the Ukrainian military conducting assessments. I think the critical points that I want to get across to you in the opening remarks are firstly that the consequences of this conflict should not be and cannot be understated. The outcome of this war will not only determine the future of European security, but will also determine, I think, the rules by which the international order functions, whether those states that are more powerful are deemed to be able to exert control, influence over their neighbors in spheres of influence or not. And secondly, and perhaps critically, NATO's ability to demonstrate that it can rise to this challenge is not just important in protecting us from Russia and Russian aggression, but also in signaling to other potential adversaries whether or not we are able to deliver upon our security commitments. And so if we are not able to rise to this challenge, then we will face serious security threats in other theaters. Now, when the war started, as was mentioned in the previous session, there were quite a lot of emphatic predictions made. My experience throughout the conflict is that it has never been on a very clear trajectory. We have been working in one direction, then another, as we have solved operational problems. And the really important thing to bear in mind there, I think, is that the outcome is absolutely not set or fixed. It is determined by what we do. And we have a huge amount of agency collectively in determining whether the Ukrainian armed forces are able to successfully achieve their military objectives or not. But secondly, and this is something that I think we have been much weaker on, while we have a clear military strategy at this point, we have a much less coherent political strategy. And the reality of the situation is that Ukraine could achieve all of its military objectives on the ground, push Russian forces out of the country, and Russia could still blockade Odessa. It could still strike Ukrainian cities on a semi-regular basis with long-range missiles, and it could still keep Ukrainian airspace closed, essentially denying Ukraine's ability to have an economy. And so unless we have a political strategy that forces the Russian government to believe that it will gain more by negotiating in earnest, then there isn't an easy end to this problem set. And we need to be working very closely as allies in that goal. And I think that brings me to the final point that I want to make in my opening remarks, which is that while logistics, defense industry, and our military are at the forefront of this effort, ultimately, there are many levers of power that have to be pulled that are not controlled by the military. Canada's decision very recently to increase enrichment of nuclear fuels, along with a number of its allies, is a good example of how bolstering the alliance's energy security is critical to underpinning the political will to continue this struggle. And so I think this is the time when a lot of the talk about good interagency and intergovernment department working that has been at the forefront of national defense strategies is going to be put to the test. So I'm very happy to answer any of your questions on kind of military considerations. That's my area of expertise, and also looking at the Russian military in particular. But I will conclude my opening remarks there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Watling. Your economy of speech is appreciated. I don't know it will be reciprocated by my colleagues, but 6-minute round to Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Dr. Watling. Could you give us some specifics around the challenges or perhaps even crisis, if that's the right word for it, around munition productions within the NATO alliance, or at least the accessible industrial capacity for Ukraine and NATO allies?
Certainly. The Ukrainians are having to fire approximately 90,000 to 140,000 rounds of 155 millimeter ammunition per month. The United States previously was able to produce fewer than 20,000 rounds a month. It is looking to significantly increase that capacity, but by the end of the year, we're still in public reporting looking at a capacity of around 40,000 rounds a month. If we look at the UK, the entire national stockpile of 155 millimeter ammunition prior to this conflict was lower in public reporting than 44,000 rounds. And our ability to manufacture 155 ammunition is at the rate of about 5,000 rounds a year. There are plans to push that to 40,000 rounds a year. But you can see, and I could go country by country when you add them up, that the entire alliance's capacity is not meeting the requirement for monthly consumption rates of ammunition. My experience of this conflict is that if you do not have firepower, you cannot maneuver. You will be fixed in place and you will be destroyed. And so a lack of fires is a recipe for very high casualties and is a sure path to defeat. And therefore, it is very important that we regenerate that industrial capacity. Now, the fact that the United States does have significant stockpiles in reserve means that we do have time to resolve this issue, but it is a complicated problem because you need to expand production of explosive energetics, you need to expand the ability to cast shells, and produce primers. And then you need to be able to handle those explosive energetics in the facilities to be able to fill those shells and to cool the explosive energetics in them. And that means that government departments that deal with planning permission, for example, are critical if this is to happen quickly. So there are international supply chain challenges. There are also regulatory challenges which ministries of defense cannot solve by themselves. And it's really important that the alliance cooperates to close that gap.
Okay, how is Canada doing in this? How can Canada be a meaningful assistance? Do you know Canada's capacity for production and what Canada would need to do to increase this production?
I'm not familiar specifically with the numbers in terms of Canada's production, but I would note that Canada is integral to the US effort to expand production. So when you look at the supply chain for US munitions, very often those munitions go back and forth between the US and Canada. And that reflects a number of specific manufacturing capabilities that you have, but also Canada's ability to generate those raw materials in terms of explosive energetics that other countries don't necessarily have access to. So Canada actually is quite important in this role. I would also commend the work of one of your former ambassadors, Wendy Gilmore, who's an assistant secretary at NATO, who is playing a leading role in trying to cohere these efforts across the alliance. And so Canada has made a significant contribution, I think, to the diplomacy to unlock some of these challenges.
All right, we're about to undertake a procurement study at this committee. Canada has a very long history of astonishingly slow military procurement. That has to change in order to give us the agility to respond to a crisis like this. Are you aware, or do you think that Canada, or indeed even as part of the North American supply chain, is Canada taking the steps that need to be taken in order to shrink eliminate this gap between expenditure and production that will surely at some point result in the Ukrainian army running out of ammunition if the bridge isn't if we don't bridge the gap?
I think that there has been a problem across the alliance of many governments, particularly outside of defense, thinking about this as a peacetime problem where you follow your traditional processes. Certainly in the UK, we are not seeing a rapid acceleration in process. And partly because it does require buy-in from other bits of government, right? The Ministry of Defense does not own all of the levers to unlock planning permissions for a munition factory, for example. And so it is really important that you have centralized government authority directing all of those other constituents and contributors to this process to make sure that there isn't an acceleration in defense signing contracts, for example, but no acceleration in the ability to find and set up appropriate facilities in order to produce more munitions. So I think I've observed that there is an urgency, a sense of urgency in the ministries of defense around NATO, but very often that doesn't translate across government.
Thank you. I owe you 15 seconds. Dr. Wadley, what I heard is maybe an interesting contribution to our study on procurement about how a 155 millimeter shell is made, and the number of times it might cross the border just to be made in North America. So, if you have other information you wish to share on that very point, I think that would be informative to us, and if you'd forward it to the clerk, that would be helpful. Madame O'Connell, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Watling, for being here. I want to touch on, to start with, in your opening remarks, you spoke about the importance of Ukraine winning this war, but the sustained winning of this war, and the implications, you said, for the future of European communities, for demonstrating NATO's strength. I think it's something that all members, certainly in our House, as well as I think in particular this committee who's been looking at that, understands this. But I think, or what I want to ask if you can elaborate on further, there will start to be the political pressures at home. I sometimes even hear in my own constituency, you're spending all that money in Ukraine. What about this country? What about that conflict? I see, in the UK, they have gone back into double-digit inflation rates. There's going to start to be pressures. The Eurozone is at 6.9% inflation. There's going to be some financial pressures on other countries. So how do you elaborate on that argument about the importance and even the economic importance in the long term of not continuing to support Ukraine?
I mean, there are plenty of examples, I think, of how the war in Ukraine is disrupting industry and doing economic harm to us. And so ending it more quickly is important for producing economic stability. A good example would be what the outpouring of grain into Romania is doing in Europe, for example, at the moment. But there's another side to this, which is that we keep framing this as money being sent to Ukraine, and it's not, right? If we're sensible about this, this is money that we are spending to create jobs and to rejuvenate complex industry in our own countries in order to achieve our security goals. I'll give you an example. In the UK, we don't produce artillery barrels anymore. We should, because there aren't enough barrel machines across Europe. So there is an opportunity there to level up, in the British government's terminology, by spending money on establishing complex manufacture and metal forging in the UK. The outcome of that is to make Ukrainian artillery more sustainable. But actually, where that money is being invested is into deprived communities in the UK. And if we're more joined up about this, then I actually think we can shift the narrative.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer. And I think that is something that we have to speak more about as well here at home, and I think in a coordinated approach with NATO and our allies, because it's important from a political perspective too to make sure our communities and our countries as a whole understand the full picture and the importance of continuing to be a strong ally for Ukraine. My next question is in regards to NATO's response and the coordination. Where would you say, or do you have thoughts and opinions on some of the strengths that maybe probably surprised Russia? We've heard a lot of testimony to that fact, but where are some weaknesses that moving forward Canada can be involved in making sure that any weaknesses or any gaps are filled within kind of the NATO system and that coordination?
In terms of weaknesses, I think one of the major ones is that distinction I made between a military strategy, which NATO has the muscle memory and the mechanisms to develop, versus a political strategy, which NATO can be a coordination body for, and the military strategy has to align with the political strategy. But ultimately, NATO doesn't have the same authorities in that space. And my observation would be that a number of different countries in the alliance have a different vision of what the outcome we would like looks like. Now, there are good reasons why that debate shouldn't be had in public. But I think constructive convening, whether that be by Canada and others who in some ways don't antagonize some of the different opinions in the alliance on that particular topic, could be very constructive to host and build a common understanding of where the alliance is trying to get to, not just what the alliance is trying to prevent in the short term.
Thank you. And following up on your comments about that political strategy, is this part of the conversation about Ukraine's future in NATO, or is this more of just the coordination in terms of, or in your view, in terms of NATO's strength moving forward and ensuring that, frankly, NATO needs to always be ready and coordinated for something like this to occur, but also, is this your political strategy comment also in relation to kind of the future of Ukraine and NATO, or the future of NATO in general, and where perhaps more work or more coordination needs to be done?
I think it's more in relation to Russia. So if we think about Russia's position, Russia is now, it has burned all of its soft power. It is in a conflict, and in Russia's terms, it is fighting NATO, not militarily, but that's how the Kremlin talks about this conflict. Now, irrespective of where the line of control is in Ukraine, that leaves a live, very dangerous relationship between NATO and Russia. And we need Russia ultimately to come to the negotiating table, not thinking that it's going to get everything that it wants, but being prepared to make concessions, which also means the Russians need to fear the alternative, right? They need to think that the alternative to not negotiating and not making concessions is less positive for their vision of where the world's going.
Thank you.
Which may mean we need to make
Unfortunately,
them
we're going to have to
uncomfortable.
leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right. Madame Michaud, 6 minutes.
You have 6 minutes, Madame Michaud. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Watling, for agreeing to answer our questions here today. It's much appreciated. Earlier, I was speaking with the other witnesses as to how things were moving ahead for the Russian troops. We know there was a leak on the American side. Secret documents were revealed. Information was in there as to what the U.S. thinks of this conflict. I'm wondering, in your opinion, has this had a negative effect on Ukrainian troop morale, on the military strategy? Has it had any positive effects on Russia? Or did it sort of not want to consider that information at all, thinking that that might have been actually an allied strategy or tactic? What do you think of that leak?
I'm afraid for legal reasons, I can't comment on the contents of the leak specifically, but to comment on the consequences of it, I think that there has been a long process of building up trust with Ukraine, which has been very important to making sure that we provide the right support, because there are a lot of things that aren't necessarily as helpful. And there can be no doubt that this will have restricted access to some of the information sharing arrangements and potentially damage that trust. That can be rebuilt, but it does, it adds friction to things. There is very much goodwill on both sides to make sure that doesn't cause problems. So I think it's not insurmountable. It's just it will add friction. On the Russian side, what was exposed would certainly provide very useful information to the Russian military that they could use to try and counter what Ukraine is trying to do in its operations over the next few months. Now, obviously, those slides relate to information that is earlier in the year. Some of those problems may have been resolved, or the dates outlined in them may no longer reflect the position. But certainly the shortage of air defense munitions, which has been widely discussed, is a very, very critical problem that has to be overcome. If the Russian Air Force can bomb from medium altitude, then that will inflict a very serious level of damage on Ukrainian forces. And so making sure that that problem is overcome is now a critical priority.
Thank you. Earlier, I was also asking the other witnesses where things stood in terms of supply issues, where Russians stood in that regard. And I've heard that, okay, there might be some issues with supply, but it's a huge country, and actually it may not be such a big problem for Russian troops. We know Putin is in an increasingly difficult position. There's the issue of support from the Russians, as well as an increase in the war effort. There were some efforts made to electronically send out mobilization notices to Russians. Are you of the same view as the previous witnesses? Do you also think that the supply issues are not actually that substantial over the long term, or do you think there may be some issues that would be to the benefit of Ukrainian troops?
Russia does face some severe supply challenges, and in particular for some of its complex weapons, their weapons are dependent upon components that are manufactured in Europe, the US, South Korea, etc., the access to which we can potentially disrupt. And so we have some agency there in making it harder for them. However, the Russians, up until towards the end of last year, had primarily stepped up the tempo of their defense production. but they had not started cannibalizing or militarizing their civilian industry. From the beginning of this year, we've observed them starting to shift civilian industries into military production, and that opens up a very significant amount of industrial capacity for their military. There is also the potential that they will receive more support in terms of workers, technicians, support from China, and material support through Iran and other countries that will allow them to expand the access to things like explosive energetics, which is a bottleneck for the Russians too. At the moment, Russian industry is lagging behind their requirements quite significantly, but depending on how competently they stitch together the aspects of their industry that they are mobilizing, they could start getting on a much more favorable trajectory in terms of production later in this year. There will be a lag, but the trajectory is increasing.
Thank you. Since the start of the war, we've been hearing that Ukrainians have, some families have been adopted by Russians. The Institute for the Study of War was saying that the Wagner Group was also training Ukrainian children for the war. Do you have any information to that extent? And what can we do to protect these Ukrainian children from that?
Briefly, please.
The critical protection is to prevent the Russians occupying any more territory and to try and negotiate for the return of children that have already been seized. I've been in areas that were occupied and been through the records in some of those areas. And it's clear that many children were taken into Russia by the Russian armed forces. This is something that's happened across the areas that they've occupied and is obviously a great concern for the Ukrainians, many of whom, through the process of filtration that was set up, separated those children from their families.
Michaud, Madame Masson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Dr. Watling, for appearing with us today. Excuse me. Many members of this committee visited Taiwan last week, and we spoke to some really incredible representatives just about how they battle misinformation campaigns, disinformation campaigns against China, and that intense relationship that they have. So in terms of what we learned, a lot of it was very, they were very proactive about that in terms of their education systems. And we heard about that in the last panel as well, just about other countries that are better about that. Can you talk to us about the UK's and what you've seen in terms of the experience of Russian misinformation campaigns, the impact on the UK, and what they're doing to defend against that as well?
Sure. I think for the last few years, there has been an obsession with misinformation on social media and this kind of thing, as though that was the primary issue. And while the Russians do exacerbate those problems and use it, what they're actually doing is they are manufacturing constituencies that elites can then use. The target for Russian information operations is actually elites in countries, people like yourselves. And what we are observing is that the Russians have set up a series of centers of special influence, as they call them, for command and control, targeting a number of countries, including the UK, Germany, France, the US, where they are conducting active measures and ultimately trying to shift policy through pushing targeted narratives at elites. Those narratives include, in the US, for example, the argument that that every dollar spent defending Ukraine is a dollar making you weaker in the Indo-Pacific, essentially exacerbating policy debates there about prioritization, pushing the argument that money should be spent to support domestic needs and fight inflation rather than support Ukraine is another one, even though Russia is the cause of a lot of that inflation through its energy campaign and economic warfare. And so the really critical thing to my mind is being much more proactive in identifying the individuals who engage with elite communities and try and seed these ideas in our policy debates. So it's about combing through and identifying individuals who are not participating politically in good faith.
And in terms of that, the weeding out of those individuals, are there countries that are doing that well, or is everybody? Is the UK have a specific strategy? Could you give us examples?
I think Estonia has done a very good job of that, going through that process. It's taken them a period of time to acknowledge that it was a problem, to build the domestic political support for doing that. In other countries, it is happening. You know, you will see a steady trickle of arrests. In the US, there are certainly individuals that are, you know, we're seeing indictments come out on a semi-regular basis. But one of the challenges with this process is that it's almost always politically contentious, because the way the Russians work is that they target organizations that give the people they recruit political legitimacy, protection, because it looks like enforcement is going after the legitimate political debates that are surrounding the organization the person is attached to, rather than going after the individual.
Okay. One of the conversations that we had in the other panel, too, that I wanted to expand on was a former NATO ambassador to Canada, or for Canada, Ms. Buck. She spoke more about targeting lesser allies, per se, making them stronger allies by talking about things like food security. And the impacts that have been seen around the world on Russia or on Ukraine's production of food. Could you expand a bit on that in terms of how Canada participates and how NATO countries, the UK, can participate in that to strengthen those lesser allyships, to make them stronger, so it has greater impact on Russia in those diplomatic formats?
If you mean, I'm going to interpret your question as partners rather than allies. So I presume you mean countries outside of the alliance who we have relationships with. Yeah. I think the issue there is that we have focused very, very directly in a lot of our information effects on English language sources or European media and that ecosystem, our own ecosystem. Whereas the Russians are extremely active across Africa, South America. And again, if you go onto elite WhatsApp groups, you know, so between MPs and this kind of thing, in those countries, you will very quickly observe a lot of Russian translated material that is in circulation among those groups, because there simply isn't an alternative narrative that is being actively promoted. And, you know, in terms of in Canada, given that you have significant numbers of personnel with both information warfare expertise, but also French language skills, you know, there are audiences that you have much more capacity to understand how the Russians are operating in those environments, but also engage and counter and just make sure that there is an alternative narrative present. But it's partly about appreciating that from Russia's point of view, this is a global effort.
And colleagues, we've got 15 minutes and 25 minutes worth of questions. Doesn't work. So we're down to 3 minutes, 331133. With that, Ms. Gallant, you've got 3 minutes, please.
Thank you. What's the greatest vulnerability that Russia faces and that perhaps can be exploited?
The low morale and poor training quality of its soldiers. Ultimately, Russia lacks leverage because it is losing ground and losing people on the battlefield. And that is the thing that we have to make sure continues. We can't let them have a ceasefire where they can put their mobilized troops through deliberate training and therefore improve their capabilities. And we also can't let them start to grind away the Ukrainians in attritional fighting, because the Ukrainians lack the firepower to hold them back. That is the critical point of leverage that we have that always will keep the Russians on the back foot.
What capabilities do you see as being vital to ensuring Ukraine is victorious in the war that hasn't been provided to Ukraine yet?
Actually, it's boring, but it's hundreds and hundreds of different very small spare parts for which the Ukrainians don't have the intellectual property and therefore the CAD drawings to be able to produce them, because they don't know the heat treatment or the tolerances, that is leading to a lot of their own equipment in terms of Soviet legacy equipment breaking down, but also equipment that's being provided by the international community breaking down. Because at the moment, Ukrainian commanders are having to decide between sending a howitzer back to Poland and not knowing when it's going to come back to them and therefore losing the capability completely, or continuing to operate it even though part of it is damaged, which then leads to the system becoming broken in a much more serious way. So working through that complex maintenance and support process for the equipment we have already provided, as well as ammunition and barrels, is, I think, the very, very under kind of appreciated aspect that we are struggling to follow through on.
Is there a legislative instrument that could be put forth to be able to mobilize production using the civilian industrial complex more quickly than we are?
I'm not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not a lawyer in Canada. So I'm afraid, I'm a military analyst. I don't know. But such a law would probably be quite useful.
Okay, so there's not a policy that you see that other countries have that we don't, in terms of some sort of standing order to flip the switch, so to speak, and have the civilian industries.
The U.S. has such legislation to enable the president to requisition industry and direct it to produce war material. Yes.
Okay, I'm done. Sorry.
Thank you. Mr. Fisher, 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Doctor, for being here. Absolutely fascinating testimony, and I hate the fact that I only have 3 minutes, so I'm going to talk really quickly and get my preamble done as soon as I can and leave the time for you to give your amazing answers. Early days, we heard about this in the news. It was on the news 24/7, the early days of the war. We're not seeing that as much now. I think the world was surprised. I was surprised. I think Canadians were surprised at the successes, the early successes that the Ukrainians had. I think we believed the hype that the big bear would come in and take right over and it would be 3 or 4 days. Probably someone in your position didn't believe that, but I think we were surprised and impressed. But now it's not on the news 24/7. We're not seeing it every single day. So I thought maybe someone with your expertise would be able to sort of fill us in on some of the latest developments, what conclusions you can draw from some of these latest developments, and how you see the conflict developing maybe in the next few months.
The next few months are going to be absolutely critical because if the Ukrainians are able to get the Russians moving backwards, the Russian command and control system is likely to make that a very chaotic process. Their headquarters are 120 kilometers from the front. If that can happen, then we might start seeing quite a rapid breakdown of the Russian defensive positions. Conversely, if the Ukrainians are not able to breach those obstacle belts that the Russians are building, and they lose those units or suffer attrition in those units that have the skills to do opposed obstacle breaching, then this could become a very, very protracted attritional fight. And we need to make sure that it goes one way rather than the other. But which way it goes will probably determine the trajectory of the war, because if it becomes protracted, then it becomes increasingly focused on infantry, and Russia can regenerate those units, whereas Ukraine will increasingly need a qualitative edge to combat Russian mass.
Your thoughts, and I don't think we only have about 45 seconds, your thoughts on China as a friend and an ally to Russia, and whether they're actually providing anything or willing to provide anything, or in the future months may consider providing anything.
China offered to provide microelectronics and other components and machine tooling for Russian industry in the very early days of the war. They've also been very important in providing finance, although they extract a lot of concessions for that. They also provide advice and engage with the Russian military in that way. There's ongoing joint training, I believe. What we haven't yet seen is whether the Chinese will set up production in Russia, so build factories in Russia and move personnel and technicians to run them. That is a major risk. I think that is much more likely than them directly supplying munitions, because the Chinese want to appear to be uninvolved. But nonetheless, their position is supportive of Russia, even if it's at arm's length.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Madame Michaud, 1 minute, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We know that Ukrainian grains that were to go to, that leave the country, have to go through European countries, given the fact that the Black Sea has been blocked. We can assume that has having an effect on the timelines, the costs of things. Now, Russia is saying that it will put a stop to certain measures if there's no lifting of restrictions against the Russians? What effect would that have on those countries who depend on these grains? For instance, Canada.
I think the most significant effect would be in countries like Lebanon, Yemen, Egypt, where those grains have been absolutely critical to the food security of the local population. That is also one of the reasons why the Russians are cautious, I think, or prepared to negotiate on this particular issue. Because if they can frame starvation or malnutrition in those countries as being caused by NATO, then that is something that they are potentially willing to bring about. If it is instead perceived in those countries as something that is being caused by the Russian blockade of Ukraine, then actually that undermines their relationship with countries that, in the case of Egypt, they have much more cooperation than others. And in the case of Syria, they are actually a security guarantor to the Assad government. So I think that's an area where there is plenty of scope for diplomacy in which we do actually have some leverage, but it would be a
Thank
humanitarian tragedy.
Sorry to keep cutting you off.
That's fine.
Madame Messon, 1 minute.
Actually, I want to just build off of one of the questions that Ms. Gallant had previously asked you. She said she asked about Russia's biggest weakness, and your response was about poor training, morale, so on. We've heard from others that the biggest weakness is the fact that they're a dictatorship, and so the attacks or the use of sanctions against oligarchs are key in that. Would you agree that maybe, you said that that's not the biggest, but is that effective? And is Canada, the world, effectively using sanctions? Are there ways that we can better do that?
The sanctions are fine. We're not very proactive at actually shutting down these businesses. The number of times I've seen an oligarch get sanctioned and then set up a front company that takes on the assets, and they then have a non-public, agreement with someone to hold it in their name, and they're able to essentially continue doing their business, is really concerning. We have a big project here that tracks smuggling of military-grade equipment out of our countries to Russia. And in the last few months of last year, we saw month-on-month increases.
Listen, I think Dr. Watling just froze. Or he's very steady, yes. Okay. He's gone?
He's gone.
The Russians. He knew that Mr. Bazan was going to ask a really sharp question, and that's why he left. Okay. Well, yeah.
Go back.
That would be terribly efficient.
Oh, he's back.
There we are. He's back. Okay.
I'm sorry, I have no idea what
It
happened.
was either the Chinese or the Russians, one or the other that got you. So,
Yeah, but we've
Mr.
seen
Bazan
month-to-month
has 3 minutes worth of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it'll be very quick, and hopefully we don't have any Russian information operations undermine Dr. Watling's testimony. Just you mentioned, Dr. Watling, about the whole issue around the war of attrition that we're facing, and particularly look at the bloody battle of Bakhmut, and just wondering, there's comments made by Wagner owner Prigozhin yesterday about that this should be the end of it, that Russia should accept what they've gained and hold on to that territory, but isn't calling for any more advances. And so when you look at, the war atrocities that have been committed by the Wagner Group, not just in Ukraine, but in Syria and elsewhere, what do you think the logic is behind that, which continues to put, Prigozhin offside with Putin? And secondly, just talk about the resilience of the Ukrainians themselves, both in the battle for Bakhmut and elsewhere, and their ability to make use of some rather archaic military equipment, but continue to surprise everyone with their effectiveness.
Over the winter, the Russian military wanted to reduce attrition in its own units, and so it allowed Wagner to take control of a large number of mobilized prisoners to basically continue the pressure on the Ukrainians without pushing that attrition onto them. As a result, they were receiving a lot of equipment provided by the GRU through the Russian Ministry of Defense. That was removed once the Russian military got back in the driving seat. Prigozhin has fairly consistently been used as a critic of not Putin, but of Shoigu, Defense Minister Shoigu, and General Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff. And so he's doing that as an outrider for a different faction within the Kremlin. I could go into the details of who, but it's probably too specific for this committee. But yeah, there's a certain amount of infighting in politics.
It'd be interesting if you provide that information on who he's working for and what he's been used as a proxy, and underline in a written reply back to committee. So I think it's something we're all actually very interested in, but time wouldn't permit you.
Yeah, exactly. Interest of time, I'm happy to follow up with the clerk and provide some written comments.
In the interest of time, we're going to have to cut it there. Colleagues, I'm sure that the conversations were very important, but they weren't nearly as important as the conversation between Mr. Bazan and Dr. Watling. So if we could keep the conversations down to a dull roar. Final 3 minutes, Madame Nambopoulos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Watling, for being here with us. You've spoken about NATO's need for Ukraine to win this in order to combat prevent potential threats in the future, and that the outcome still very much depends on what we do at this point. The next few months will be critical, and NATO has to help Ukraine avoid a protracted fight, which Russia would eventually, get the upper hand in. So if you were in a room with NATO's decision makers today, what is that message, that one message that you would be giving them that they need to do in order to help Ukraine push the Russians back in the next few months?
That we don't need large political statements anymore. This is not about getting ministers to sign off on new equipment. It is about the detailed, dull drudgery of working through all of the contracts to make sure that the equipment we've already provided can be maintained, building dedicated training for things like brigade and battalion staff so that the Ukrainians can integrate all of the different capabilities that they're being given, and making sure that that pipeline of training is coherent between Interflex in the UK, where we do basic training, and then company and battalion training across Europe, so that the Ukrainians have an assured pipeline for generating units that are more capable than their adversaries. Same thing with the supply chains in terms of our industrial base. This is not about big ticket items. It is about very, very detailed work that just has to be lined up, racked and stacked. And that's about discipline and follow through.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave it there. I appreciate your testimony, and I think you've taught us a lot today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wadley. I regret having to bring this meeting to a conclusion. I'm sure we could go on for several hours of further questions, but we're not able to. So again, on behalf of the committee, thank you. And colleagues, before we go, just a couple of housekeeping items, which is more for information than anything else. We passed the report of the subcommittee, and the anticipation was that we would start with the health study on Tuesday. The anticipation was that we would have officials. Officials are not available, so we may have a hybrid study on Tuesday of the health witnesses that will get us started. And if not available or not fully available, we may add in an American person with respect to the Ukrainian threat analysis. So stay tuned. We're kind of scrambling on the study for Tuesday. Minister Anand has agreed for May 2nd for the estimates. May 5th will be canceled because of the Liberal convention. May 19th is canceled because of the NDP convention. Oh, is it block? Okay, block. And, yeah. Well, maybe the NDP might like to go to the block convention. I don't really know. The May's 9th, 12th, and 16th are reserved for the Health and Transition Services Study. June 1st, you will receive an invitation, or prior to June 1st, you'll receive an invitation from the French Embassy for supper. And on May 8th, the Deputy Polish Minister is available but can only meet members at 1:15. If you could kind of indicate to me who might be available, and we'll make some arrangements. The clerk will make some arrangements. Yes, Cheryl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just wondering, at some point, if we are completely devoid of witnesses, if we could put the ambassador from Taiwan to Canada on notice that he may be called on short notice to present an update of the situation in the Indo-Pacific, specifically with respect to Taiwan, if we find ourselves in the situation that we appear to be facing next week. Thank you.
Okay. Certainly won't get any objection from the chair on that. So I'll bear that in mind. We'll see how we scramble for Tuesday. Ideally, we stay within our, what we've already agreed to, but if there's a gap, a looming gap, we will. Okay. Any others? With that, meeting adjourned. Thank you very much.